An 89-year-old woman shuffled down Main Street, only to be ambushed by a cruel gang of teens. They mocked her, called her a crawling turtle, then viciously shoved her into the path of an oncoming truck. Their demonic laughter echoed, but they had no idea they'd just crossed a legendary warrior. 20 minutes later, the Marines arrived, and justice was served. This is a story of retribution, of honor, and of a flame that never dies. Join us to uncover it. Dusk settled over Fairview, Virginia, casting a faint golden-orange glow across Main Street. Crimson maple leaves drifted down, mingling with the soft whistle of autumn wind through the trees. At the street's edge, Margaret Maggie Green, 89, walked slowly along the sidewalk. Her wooden cane tapped a steady rhythm. Each tap, a quiet assertion of her presence. Her deep green eyes, though clouded by time, still burned with resilience. Today, like every Saturday evening, she headed to Sweet Haven Bakery, where a cream puff awaited a small comfort in her quiet life. But the peaceful air grew heavy. In the distance, a group of 5 teens loitered near an abandoned general store, dressed in dark hoodies and torn jeans, their smug grins curled with malice. As Maggie drew near, a tall one with garish green hair stepped into her path. "Hey, old lady," he shouted, his voice shrill with mockery. "Moving that slow. You won't reach the bakery till Christmas." The others burst into laughter, their cold cackles echoing down the empty street. Maggie paused, leaning on her cane, her gaze locking onto the boy's eyes. "You should step aside, young man," she said, her voice calm but sharp, like a blade beneath a sheath. The teens laughed louder. "Step aside. Can you even walk fast enough to need it another?" His face speckled with acne, jeered. Passers-by, a mother with a stroller. An old man on a bench glanced over, but none spoke. The air thickened as if the town held its breath. Then, in a fleeting moment, all boundaries shattered. The green-haired teen, his smile cruel, stepped closer. "Let me help you speed up," he snarled. And before Maggie could react, he shoved her shoulder hard. Her frail legs buckled. Her cane clattered to the ground with a dry crack. She fell into the street just as a truck roared toward her. Its horn blared, piercing the air. With her last strength, Maggie rolled aside, narrowly escaping the wheels by inches. The teens clapped wildly as if watching a street stunt. "Nailed it, Grandma." "Do it again," the green-haired one hollered, his voice gleeful. The others howled, slapping each other's backs, then slipped into the dark alley behind the old warehouse, leaving Maggie on the pavement. Her breath labored, dust coating her gray sweater. A passer-by, an elderly newsstand vendor, rushed over. "Mrs. Green, are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger and worry. Maggie, with his help, rose slowly. She brushed off the dust, retrieved her cane, and nodded. "I'm fine," she said, her calm uncanny. But her eyes, behind silver-framed glasses, flashed a chilling spark. A flame of war that never died. She didn't scream, didn't curse. Instead, her hand reached into her coat pocket, pulling out an old phone, and her trembling fingers began to dial. In the small apartment at the end of Oak Street, a warm golden light spilled across weathered oak walls. There, Margaret Maggie Green lived alone, surrounded by relics of a fiery past. On the wall opposite the door, a row of medals hung silently in a glass frame, a silver star from Korea, glinting like moonlight in the dark, a purple heart from Vietnam, stained with blood and tears, and badges from the Gulf. Proof of a heart that never yielded, but Maggie never boasted. To her, those medals weren't trophies to flaunt, but reminders of comrades, of those who fell, and of a sworn oath to uphold honor. Maggie, now 89, was a figure of unwavering resolve. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and her frail hands steadily gripped her wooden cane. Every morning, rain or chill, she forced herself to walk a loop around Fairview. "The body may weaken," she'd mutter, her low voice speaking to her past, but the spirit never does. War scars, hidden beneath thick wool sweaters, ached in the cold. Yet they never slowed her. For her, walking wasn't just for health, it was a reminder she was still a warrior. She lived by principles, as she had led comrades through Vietnam's jungles or the Gulf's deserts. Calm, dignified, and intolerant of injustice. In Fairview, folks knew her as a kind old lady, smiling at children and greeting neighbors. But few knew that behind her smile lay a will of steel forged in 3 wars. She sought no recognition, no spotlight. But when wronged, as on Main Street this evening, the flame within her, the flame of a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, smoldered anew. In that moment, standing on the sidewalk with a fresh bruise on her arm. Maggie didn't let anger guide her. The teens had shoved her into the street, laughing at her pain, but she didn't scream or curse. Instead, she felt a familiar pulse, the same one that had pounded in her chest, facing enemies on the battlefield. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, flashed a razor-sharp glint. From her coat pocket, she drew an old phone, her trembling fingers dialing with precision. The line connected, and she spoke, her voice slow but commanding. "Gunnery Sergeant Green here. I need Gunny Miller, now." Maggie wasn't one for vengeance, but she understood the value of honor. Today, those teens have crossed an unforgivable line. As she hung up, a cold wind swept through, carrying whispers of the past. She stood there on the empty sidewalk, small but unyielding, a beacon that never dimmed in the dark. On Main Street in Fairview, the fading dusk gave way to long shadows stretching across the sidewalk. Margaret Maggie Green stood there, small but unyielding, her hand gripping the dust-stained wooden cane from her fall. The bruise on her arm throbbed, but her face showed no trace of pain. The teens who'd shoved her into the street, mocking her frailty, had vanished into the alley behind the old warehouse. Passers-by, after a moment of shock, began to disperse, leaving Maggie with the elderly newsstand vendor, who still asked, voice trembling, "Mrs. Green, are you sure you're okay?" Maggie nodded, her lips pressed tight. "I'm fine. Henry," she said. Her calm so striking it startled the old man. Not a sigh, not a curse, but in her deep green eyes, behind silver-framed glasses, a flame smoldered, the flame of a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant who'd faced enemies in the crucible of war. She wasn't one to crumble, and her silence wasn't weakness. It was the harbinger of a storm. She reached into her sweater pocket, pulling out an old push-button phone, its keys yellowed by time. Her frail fingers, trembling with age, dialed with the precision of one who'd once wielded a rifle. The line connected after 2 rings. "Fairview Recruiting Station." A deep male voice answered. Maggie took a steady breath, her voice slow but commanding, like an order on the battlefield. Gunnery Sergeant Green speaking. "I need Gunny Miller. Now." On the other end, the air seemed to be still. The young Marine on duty patched the call through without hesitation. Gunny Miller, the station's commanding sergeant, was a towering man with eyes sharp as a blade. He'd met Maggie at a veterans ceremony, where he'd heard tales of her exploits, the woman who led comrades through Vietnam's jungles, survived the Gulf's deserts, and earned medals any soldier would envy. When her voice came through, Gunny shot to his feet, his hand gripping the receiver. "Gunnery Sergeant Green," he said, voice thick with respect. "What do you need?" Maggie didn't waste words. With the clarity of a battlefield report, she recounted the incident, the alley behind the warehouse, 5 teens, their insults, the shove, and their gleeful laughter as she nearly died under a truck's wheels. She described the ringleader precisely: green hair, black hoodie, shrill voice. "They thought I was a useless old woman," she said, her tone even but icy. "I want them taught a lesson, Gunny, not with fists, but with honor." Gunny Miller paused for a heartbeat, then replied, "Understood, ma'am. We'll handle it now." He hung up, turning to the young recruits training at the station. "Marines, gear up. We've got a mission to restore honor for a gunnery sergeant. No questions, no hesitation." The sound of combat boots echoed, and the air in the station tightened like a coiled spring. Meanwhile, Maggie pocketed the phone, brushed off her sweater, and resumed her walk to Sweet Haven Bakery. Passers-by still glanced her way, but none saw the glint in her eyes, the spark of a woman who knew that, in mere minutes, justice would be served. She didn't need to shout to prove her strength. Her silence, like a chambered round, awaited its moment to fire. In the shadowy alley, the teens' laughter still echoed. 5 of them, in dark hoodies with smug grins, gathered around a wooden crate. The ringleader, Kyle, with garish green hay perched atop it, boasted about shoving the old lady into the street. "Bet she won't leave her house again." He crowed, his shrill voice slicing through the chilly dusk. The others nodded, clapping as if they'd won a twisted game. They had no idea that, blocks away, a storm was brewing. 20 minutes after Maggie's call, the roar of engines tore through the alley's quiet. 2 olive-green military trucks pulled up, blocking the exit. Doors slammed open, and Gunnery Sergeant Gunny Miller stepped out, his towering frame clad in a crisp black-green uniform. Behind him, 10 young Marines followed, each standing rigid as statues, their eyes cold and piercing. Headlights from the trucks flooded the alley, exposing the panic on the teens' faces. Kyle leaped off the crate, trying to act tough. "What are you doing here?" he yelled, his voice trembling. "We didn't do anything," but his words drowned in the overwhelming presence of the Marines. Gunny Miller advanced, stopping mere feet from Kyle. He didn't raise his voice, but each word landed like a hammer. "You think pushing an old lady into the street is a joke," he growled, his gaze locking onto Kyle's. "You think insulting a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant is nothing." The teens froze, rooted to the spot. One, his face speckled with acne, stammered, "The old lady's a Marine." Gunny nodded, his voice low but commanding. "Margaret Green fought in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf. She earned medals you couldn't dream of. And you, a punk kid, dared to touch her honor." Kyle, the loudest before, now stared at the ground, his hands clutching his hoodie's hem. The others trembled, their eyes darting for an escape, but the alley was sealed. Gunny signaled, and the young Marines stepped forward, forming 2 steel lines, a corridor, trapping the teens. No slaps, no punches. But their present soldiers with unyielding postures and merciless eyes was a weight heavier than lead. Gunny leaned closer to Kyle, his voice dropping, each word searing into their minds. "Honor isn't a game. Today, you'll learn that the Marine way." The teens stood still, barely breathing. The wind whistled through the alley, carrying autumn's biting chill. Far off, the faint glow of Sweet Haven Bakery flickered, where Maggie sat, waiting. But in this alley, the confrontation had shifted everything. The reckoning wasn't just the Marines' arrival, it was a declaration that injustice wouldn't stand. And the lesson, though unfinished, had begun. In the dark alley, the air hung heavy as lead. The teens, who'd laughed arrogantly minutes before, now stood hunched, shrinking under the piercing gazes of 10 Marines. Gunnery Sergeant Gunny Miller, towering in his crisp black-green uniform, stared straight at Kyle, the green-haired kid who'd shoved Margaret Maggie Green into the street. The autumn wind whistled through, carrying a biting chill, but none of the teens dared move. They were caught in a storm of honor. Gunny Miller stepped forward, his combat boots echoing thud, thud on the dirt. He stopped before Kyle, his eyes boring into the boy's soul. "Honor," he said, his voice low but resonant, "is something you don't understand, but today you'll learn." He signaled, and the young Marines advanced, forming a steel circle around the teens. No fists, no threats, but their presence soldiers with unyielding postures. Faces stoic was enough to make Kyle and his gang tremble. Gunny began a Marine-style lesson. He spoke of Maggie Green, his voice deliberate, powerful, like words carved into stone. She led comrades through Vietnam's jungles, where death stalked every step. She survived the Gulf's deserts, where scorching sand and bullets fell like rain. She earned a Silver Star, a Purple Heart medals you'll never dream of. He paused, eyeing each teen. "And you dared call her a crawling turtle." Dared shove her into the street. Kyle bowed his head, his hands clenched white. Another teen, voice shaking, stammered, We didn't know." Gunny cut him off, his tone as sharp as a blade. "Ignorance isn't an excuse. Disrespect is a choice, and bad choices have consequences." For the next 10 minutes, he and the young Marines taught the teens about honor, sacrifice, and the cost of arrogance. Each word was a hammer. Waking young, wayward souls. Kyle, once the loudest, stood silent, eyes red, unable to look up. When the lesson ended, Gunny ordered, "Line up, follow me," the teens, now subdued shadows, shuffled out of the alley behind the Marines. They were led to Sweet Haven Bakery, where Maggie sat on a wooden bench, a cream puff untouched in her hand. The sunset bathed her face in red, highlighting her deep green eyes, still fierce with resolve. Gunny Miller approached, stood at attention, and saluted sharply. "Gunnery Sergeant Green," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Honor has been restored." Maggie, leaning on her cane, rose slowly. She returned a precise salute, her trembling hands steady with purpose. The 10 young Marines behind saluted in unison, their boots snapping together, a symphony of respect. Passers-by stopped, watching the moment with awe. A mother with a stroller wiped tears. The elderly newsstand vendor clapped, his voice hoarse. "That's Maggie Green." Maggie smiled, a faint but profound curve of her lips. "Thank you, Gunny," she said, her voice warm, steady. "But next time, tell the kids not to make me call you." Gunny chuckled, a rare sound amid his sternness. The teens stood behind, heads bowed, unable to meet her gaze. But in their eyes, for the first time, something shifted, respect and regret. In the days following the alley incident, Fairview seemed to breathe anew. The autumn sun still cast its gentle glow on Main Street. But the air now carried a quiet reverence, as if the town had learned an unspoken lesson. Margaret Maggie Green, 89, still walked slowly along the sidewalk each day, her wooden cane tapping a steady rhythm. Her gray sweater, though worn, was now met with different eyes of respect, not indifference. Every Saturday evening, Maggie visited Sweet Haven Bakery, where the young owner kept a cream puff ready, paired with a warm smile. "Here's yours, Mrs. Green," she'd say, her voice full of deference. Maggie only smiled, nodding lightly, as if nothing had changed. but passing the recruiting station on Oak Street, young Marines in sharp black-green uniforms snapped to attention, saluting. Gunnery Sergeant Green, a recruit, called, his hand raised crisply. Maggie waved, her deep green eyes twinkling with mischief. At ease, she said, her warm, low voice sparking laughter among the young men. The teens who'd wronged her had changed, too. Kyle, the green-haired ringleader, no longer dyed his hair. He and his friends now greeted her with bowed heads on the street. "Hello, Mrs. Green," they'd say, their voices soft but sincere. Once, Kyle paused, awkwardly scratching his head. I'm sorry about that day," he mumbled, eyes fixed on the ground. Maggie looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. "Learn from it and hold on to it," she replied, then walked on. Kyle stood there, silent, as if absolved but entrusted with a duty. Maggie's story spread through Fairview, from the bakery to the coffee shop, from schoolrooms to the recruiting station. People spoke of the old woman who was a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant who faced a war and injustice with the same steely will. They told of the day the Marines arrived, of the solemn salute under the sunset, and the lesson of honor that transformed a street corner. Never underestimate anyone, the elderly newsstand vendor told kids gathered around him. Some quiet folks held this country together. Maggie never spoke of it again. In her small apartment, her medals hung silently on the oak wall, glinting like stars under the table lamp's light. Each night, she sat by the window, gazing at Oak Street's flickering streetlights. She thought of comrades, of fiery days, and of Fairview where she'd won another victory. Not with bullets, but with honor. And somewhere, in the town's narrow streets, a message echoed. Gentle yet profound, always respect others, no matter who they are, for sometimes the person you overlook is a beacon that never dims, illuminating an era. The story of Maggie Green, Fairview's unyielding Marine, is a reminder. Respect isn't just words, it's how we treat each other, no matter who they are. Under the town's soft streetlights, Maggie taught a community about honor and compassion. What do you think of her story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and share this video to spread the message, one small act can change the world. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.